Good morning, everyone. I hope that you have been keeping well. It's a delight to be invited to again visit the University of Chile, even if somewhat remotely. I have very fond memories of the time I had the opportunity to meet and work with a number of you. I can't remember the time now, but quite some time ago. The presentation today, Building Your Career Through Teaching, is based on a chapter in a forthcoming book. I have provided a copy, a proof copy of that for you, so I apologise for the draft notes, but I thought it may well be interesting and useful for you to consider as you build your career with a focus on teaching. This is not to say it's not relevant for people who have a research teaching focus, or even people who are teaching and research scholars or research focused people. It's a way to think about your career and how you are going to demonstrate and document your teaching effectiveness as a teacher, regardless of your role and emphasis in your career. So an overview for today is to consider the role of teaching in your career, the level of knowledge and expertise that you should be demonstrating in terms of what you understand about teaching and how you can build that over time. Then looking at how you demonstrate your achievements against criteria, bringing it together to build a profile, and then managing your career. Again, all of these steps have been followed through in terms of the chapter. So if this is of interest to you, you will find much more elaboration in the chapter that you can get from the organisers. So let's begin. So it's important to think about your role, the role of teaching in your career. What is your position? If it's an academic position, is it a research and teaching appointment? Is it research focused, teaching focused, industry focused? All of those will involve some teaching, whether it's with clients, whether it's with people in industry, whether it's postgraduate students, whether it's lecturing and teaching in the undergraduate and postgraduate program. Some of you will be researchers with some teaching, all of which involves supervision of students, research students, guest lecturers, engagement with the research community and presenting on your work. These are very valuable teaching skills that are required to be effective in that role. Similarly, for industry professionals who may have some teaching, for example, supervision of industry placements, internships, guest lecturers, industry liaison. And a number of you will be teaching only appointments, even if in name only. So it might be a professional or teaching contract. You might be appointed as a tutor in vocational education, or in as a part-time tutor or lecturer, where essentially you're expected to only teach. So once you think about your role, all of those involve some level of teaching. And so thinking about the level of your performance that you are going to be aiming for as a teacher, you need to think about, because it requires a different level of input and development in order to attain that level. So there's some work by Helen King, who really has teased out the words and the level of expectation of performance that might be expected. So she describes the work of effective, meaning that teaching is orientated to students and their learning, and it uses skills and practices that are confirmed to be effective by research and meet the requirements of the context. So all teaching, regardless of whatever your role is, should be effective. And so the work that needs to be done to be effective is to ensure that it is orientated to students and their learning, and that you are using the skills and practice that are effective, informed by the research in teaching effectiveness. So just doing what you and how you were taught is not effective. It may well be effective by a chance, but unless you know that it is, and unless you are using it deliberately in a way that is informed by what we know to be effective, then it's unlikely to be able to be claimed as effective. Essentially, it's practice making practice. If you're doing what you've been doing forever, it doesn't mean that that is effective. It means that you're doing it over and over and over again. It becomes habit, but its degree of effectiveness may well be questioned. When you think about expert, it involves everything from that is part of being effective, but it's a step higher. So it's self-determined, continuous learning and development through a process of deliberate practice. That means that all aspects of your teaching are interrogated, evaluated, evidence sought on its practice, using and applying what we know about effective teaching through the scholarship of teaching and learning, through the research on teaching and learning, so that over time it's continuing to develop. What you're doing now should not have been what you were doing 10 years ago. It should be a continuous process of development, improvement, enhancement, maybe in different areas. So perhaps if certain areas are very effective, then you might have then taken more of an interest in development in, say, curriculum development or assessment development or in mentoring and working with students. But it's continuous, it's development, and you demonstrate mastery of your profession and or your discipline. So that means you are considered by others and your students as an expert teacher, and that you can demonstrate that. And Helen King would argue that that's what people, particularly those who are teaching focused or teaching only positions, should all be aiming for. So everyone who is teaching should be effective and be informed about what effective is. People who are on the teaching focused role should be expert and should be able to demonstrate that and be acknowledged as that. Her argument is that excellent is not for everyone. So excellence by its meaning means beyond or surpassing others. So if you're determined to be excellent, it is typically meaning you're a higher level than other people and that you are surpassing others to be acknowledged as that. She also argues that it's a static point. You're determined to be excellent if you receive an award or a promotion at a particular point in time. So it's where you have been judged against others as having surpassed them. Another way of viewing this is to consider the level of performance as an inverted triangle. So with everyone being effective, and that will be the majority of people, whatever their role. Fewer people being expert, but they would be the ones who particularly have teaching as a focus. And then a very much smaller number of people who are judged to be excellent. We would all like to be judged as excellent, but this is sort of an inverted hierarchy as well. So effectiveness leads into expert, leads into excellence. The criteria listed here have been deeply researched and have been sourced by a review of both the literature and what is available and what most universities list as their teaching criteria. So you may find that some universities have more, some have less, but most will be a composite or a collection of these sorts of criterion. If you haven't got criteria at your university, you may wish to use these as a way for thinking about how you're going to collect evidence on your effectiveness and how you can document it. The website here goes to a site which elaborates on each one and provides you examples of how people have demonstrated and described their contribution under each of these. So it's a useful site that may be of value to you when you consider your evidence. The other thing to think about for these criteria are that they do not change for the level of your contribution. So regardless of whether you're a tutor, a professor, these are designed to be appropriate for your work. If you're a professor, the way you might detail the design and planning of learning experiences might be at the whole of curriculum level, where you have a hand in the design and planning of a whole of degree program or a major, as well as perhaps contribution or design of units within that degree program. A tutor, on the other hand, may design and plan the learning experiences of 2 or 3 topics within the unit. And so how do they go about doing that? And do they know it's effective? A lecturer or associate professor may be responsible for 1 or 2 units that they design and plan. So regardless of your position, these can be scaled up in scale and scope as to what your contribution and responsibility for them are. So in the chapter, each of these are elaborated on what is meant by them. But just briefly, so design and planning of learning experiences, I've covered a little. The teaching and supporting learning is what do you do in your teaching on a day-to-day level. So, and the scope of teaching is quite broad. It's not just undergraduate teaching, it might be postgraduate teaching, it might be teaching that involves the supervision of postgraduate students. So what do you do and how do you plan your teaching experiences? What practices, what methods of teaching do you use and why? And how do they support the student learning? Similarly, for assessment and giving feedback to students, do you design the whole of assessment for a course, for a unit, for just a topic? And perhaps if you're a tutor, your role in assessment might be on marking and giving feedback to students on their learning. If you have no responsibility, how do you give students feedback that they're learning the topics well? So do you devise a quiz? Do you devise ways in which students can understand what their level of learning is and how they're progressing? Developing an effective learning environment, student support and guidance. So again, some people have a large role in this as student advisors or as planning a whole of curriculum program, but others are how do you manage your classroom so that students are supported, feel welcome, and that they are able to develop their learning in a role and in a class where they are welcomed and their learning is respected. Too many times we hear of bullying either by students or of teachers, or belittling of students, or where students who are in minorities do not feel welcome. And so how do you build that environment? Because that is critical for students to feel they can learn in a safe place. That can also include aspects particularly around online learning. And in fact, all of these will apply to online learning. And I know that many of you have been deeply involved in developing learning and your teaching in an online space, particularly over the last year or two. It's not a new change because these practices of online learning have been developing over many years, but many of us were thrust into having to do it regardless of whether we wanted to do it. So how do you create a learning environment that supports students in those circumstances? How do you integrate the scholarship, the research in your discipline, and professional activities, particularly with industry and so on, into your teaching? So they can be separate. How do you integrate the scholarship of teaching? How do you use that and combine that with your practice? How do you bring in the research and the current developments of research and develop the research skills of your students in your practice? Or how do you bring in the professional activities of students who are going into industry-based practices, internships, preparing them for professional work? How do you evaluate your practice and continuous professional development? You'll remember around the concept of expertise, that ongoing evaluation of practice and continuous professional development that is deliberate. Not I'll just attend a dozen workshops in professional development, but I'll attend these particular courses in professional development because I need to develop this aspect of my practice. I'll read these books because they are related to the development that I need to do based on my evaluation. The final one is your professional and personal effectiveness. These rarely appear in teaching criteria, but these are the ones that the students rate extraordinarily high in terms of how they view teachers. And so we've included this as a way to highlight the importance of professional communication, the importance of being on time, the importance of preparing notes and responding to students in a timely and respectful way. These are developed more, as I say, in the chapter and on the website, but they are very important professional and personal effectiveness aspects that are important to students, and whether they stay in your class, whether they stay in the course, whether they feel respected, these are all critical and should not be ignored simply because they're not on a specific criterion list. These are the websites that I mentioned. So the University Teaching Criteria one has each of those 7 criteria listed and developed and illustrated in different ways. And this one, rewarding and recognising and rewarding teaching, is a little bit more perhaps for institutions to consider how they might recognise and reward teaching in a more effective way. So, thinking about those 7 criterion and how you're now going to produce and gather the evidence, what you are encouraged to do is think about those sources. So typically when we think about evidence, we think about student input, student feedback, student surveys, informal feedback. This is the students' experiences and perceptions of our teaching. Some people don't like them. That's really not up for discussion, but in fact too much emphasis is put on these as something that perhaps is more robust and independent. It's important, but it's not the only source of information. And so we need to understand that student input is one of 4 sources. It is not the only source. The other sources are peers and colleagues, where we might seek feedback from junior and senior colleagues, co-teachers, teaching experts, and we seek evidence across multiple dimensions of our teaching. So classroom teaching is just one dimension. When people think about peer review of teaching, they typically think of someone coming into their classroom and giving them feedback on their teaching. That's just one dimension. There are at least 10 that I've documented that can be reviewed by your peers and colleagues, and that can be just your assessment practices. That can be on your curriculum. It can be on how you interact with your students. It can be on how you supervise students. It can be on your leadership contribution, and so on. So there is an opportunity to think much more broadly, and also in terms of who provides the evidence. So junior or co-teachers are a very valuable source to seek feedback in a collegial way and comment and develop each other's teaching professionally. But when it comes to perhaps a promotion application, then getting feedback from someone who is an expert teacher on your assessment, on your curriculum, that is perhaps a more senior colleague, a supervisor, or a colleague from a completely different university who's acknowledged as an expert. So there are a whole lot of roles that we can have reviewed, and there are different levels of colleagues that we can use to draw on to collect that evidence. This one, student achievement, is very, very rarely used, but it's what we are about as teachers. We say that we're supporting student learning, so the quality of our student learning is something that we really should think about as to how we can collect evidence on that, and there are many ways to do that. So we have students learning verified by their grades, by their progression, by their employment outcomes, by their externally verified standards of learning. So a lot of work is marked by people external to yourself, for thesis, for project work. These are externally verified standards, and while the learning has been done and the work has been done by students, you can claim a contribution to the students' learning and their achievements, and in ways that are valid. So really thinking about that and investigating that is particularly important. And other sources of evidence are our self-assessment. These are your leadership roles and your contributions, your evaluation strategies and responding to that. So this is you perhaps going through the student input and saying, well, the students consistently comment on my lack of organisation. So how do you respond to that? And how does that then be reflected in student input in subsequent iterations of your teaching? So it's systematic evaluation and responding to the evidence that you're gaining over time. and what you do about it. So it's the idea of your purposeful professional development, your purposeful evaluation of your practice and how it's developed and improved. So now we have our criteria where we're gathering evidence from, and every one of those criteria can have 4 sources of evidence that provide a comprehensive picture of what it is that you are doing in that. So for student input, peers and colleagues, student achievement and self-assessment can all be applied against each of the criterion, so that it's not just relying on student input on some of them. That gives a much richer picture. It gives a better range and type of evidence that is robust and valid. So now bringing it together, you need to collect and collate the evidence systematically, not 5 months before you're going to have a promotion application. This is something you collect and collate systematically over time. You need to build a dossier under each criterion. So what evidence do you have for each criterion? Some you will have greater strengths than others, and there shouldn't be an expectation that you are expert and strong in each and every one of them. It's important to address each and every one of them because they are all dimensions of teaching, but some you will have strengths in. And so some of the most effective and expert teachers are not particularly great teachers in front of students. They're diligent, they're engaging, they're thoughtful, but they perhaps don't have the charisma. That's fine. Not everyone can be charismatic, but they might be, an expert on curriculum development or on assessment and have a huge influence on the design of the particular courses students do, their assessment practices and so on. And they could be verified by experts in the field, by universities that have adopted their practice, by being a senior member of a discipline group or whatever. So some will have strengths, and that's fine. It's very unlikely you will be expert at each and every one of those criterion. So build a dossier under each criteria. Write an overview of your achievements under each criterion and what evidence you have to support your claim for effectiveness or expertise. So what's the substance of your claim? Do you have evidence to support that from the 4 sources? 3 sources will be fine, but more than 1 would be expected. For each criterion, conclude with your leadership contribution. What did you do? What did you introduce? Now, this is not just for people who are in senior roles. As a tutor, did you institute something? Did you do something differently? Did you support or do something that has been adopted across the course or by other tutors? Or is it something that the students gave feedback on something that you did? So your leadership is relative to your position. But what have you done? What have you instituted? What have you initiated? And how did that get recognised perhaps beyond yourself? And then once you've done that, write an overall statement that highlights your strengths, your leadership contributions, and your future development and career plans. So you need to be quite explicit on, I've been doing this, I'm working on that, these are my plans, this is where I really have strengths and the evidence for it, and I'm going to continue in this way with these particular career goals, development goals, and so on. So thinking about your career and your expertise overall and bringing that together is an important step. So Now it comes to managing your career. You may be expert, you may be loved by your students, you may be getting huge, great student satisfaction ratings, but it's quite possible that nobody else knows about it but you. You do need to manage your career. We would hope that people would notice, but it's very hard. Most of your supervisors or heads of schools will know a little bit about you and what you do. They might know that they don't get a lot of complaints. They might know that you do one or two things, but they don't know the overall picture of you. So you need to present and plan as to how you can bring that to the attention of your supervisor, ready for career promotion, leadership opportunities, and so on. So it's very important that you understand your institution's performance review and promotion policies, and they change. So keep track of those, because when you are appointed to your position, the policies and practices could have now changed. Discuss the policies and performance expectations with your supervisor, your head of school, and with experienced colleagues, so that you get a sense of what's needed. Someone who was promoted 10 years ago probably doesn't have a good understanding of what's required now, because again, expectations change. So discuss what the expectations are so that you have a clear idea. A number of supervisors are good at supervising their staff in research, but less so in teaching. And so part of your role is to educate your supervisor into how to understand effective teaching. So by putting together your dossier, your teaching portfolio, showing them how you can evidence your meeting of the criteria is important. So discuss your career plans and directions with your supervisor regularly. If it's not required, do it anyway. If you can have a performance review, do it. They're not always fun to look forward to, but if you don't bring your performance to the attention of your supervisor, they will not know what you do. So discuss your performance and achievement across all of the criteria, and proactively seek opportunities to expand on your strengths and develop areas less strong. But don't be fooled into thinking you've got to be strong in all of them. That no one's really, or very few people are strong in all of them. But seek opportunities where there's your strengths, your areas that you're really interested in, and talk to your supervisor where there might be opportunities for that. It's very important to seek mentors and expand networks beyond your school or department. What roles and mentors can you seek within the university, within your discipline and national networks? Because promotion, particularly in career progression, comes from people knowing about you and knowing about the work you're doing. So regardless of how wonderful you're doing within your school, no one will know about it. So while everyone is so busy, everyone is so, it's easy for teachers to get sort of known perhaps within their school, but not wider. And it's really important that you've sought out mentors, that you've sought out networks so that you can engage with others to learn, to develop, to find out what's happening beyond your particular school, within your discipline, but also within national networks, so that people know about you and that the work that you're doing is recognised more widely. That's the sort of overview of the chapter, the steps to think about. There's lots more information in the chapter. There's a new book coming out. This is the first edition. The second edition will have a slightly different cover, and it should be out in about June. So I'm just highlighting that things are there, but that's where the chapter is that you can access should you be interested in this further. So thank you very much. I look forward now to your questions and discussing this further with you. Thank you.